live in nature anymore. We live in a kind of a created nature, which has its own set of problems.
People have all sorts of misconceptions about technology, and in fact, technology is a very hard category for people to make sense of.
Here's this strange stuff, this stuff that affects our lives so much, and how can it just come out of somebody's head? The question then is, who is this somebody?
Some people think it's all a matter of insight and genius. Other people think that it's really all designed almost according to a plan.
But whose plan? Technology wields awesome power, yet the forces which shape and deliver it seem a mystery.
The mystery is not why we have technology, but why technology has suddenly taken off. Why, and just in the last few centuries, it suddenly exploded.
All over the world, dictionaries say that invention is the process which shapes technology. But they don't say how it happens. With no hard explanation, invention has become shrouded in myth.
The biggest myth that surrounds invention is that invention is usually a major technological change. That is just not so. Most invention nowadays is what we call incremental invention, those small improvements to processes or products that make those processes or products more marketable, more efficient, whatever. And the invention can be for anything, anything from paper clips to microcomputers, even for babies' diapers, nappies.
Was your baby's skin clammy this morning?
Nappies are a typical modern technology. They're also big business. Great Britain spends £450 million on them each year, and the United States gets through 40 million diapers every day. Anyone who can build a better nappy can grab a bigger slice of this pie. Today's disposable diaper is precision engineered.
Only Pampers Baby Dry.
There's a tremendous amount of technology in diapers. For instance, material technology is very, very important for all the different layers that are used in nappies. Plastics technology for the outer coating. Adhesives technology for the way you actually join all the different layers together. That's very important. Fastening technology, the technology of fasteners that actually, hold the nappy up. And production line technology is important because you want to produce these things en masse at a cheap price, so production techniques will also come into it.
Like the production line which makes them, each part of a disposable diaper is engineered to carry out a specific job.
Most of the inventions in diapers are aimed at getting the liquid to go away from the baby's skin. That's the basic idea. And to do that, you have a number of layers.
Diaper design is a cutthroat world. The baby's bottom is a new frontier. Careers and corporate futures all rest on this super absorbent layer. Each manufacturer keeps their formula a closely guarded secret. To see what the competition is up to, a sample must be coated in a layer of pure gold, just a few atoms thick. This scanning electron microscope can reveal the structure of the diaper, using techniques which were first developed for radar and television. Both the microscope and the diaper are typical modern technologies. They're built using components which were first created to solve other problems. Until the mid-1980s, diaper designers relied solely on paper fibers to form the absorbent layer. But in 1987, a revolutionary diaper was launched, including a material that came from a seemingly unrelated area of science. The bulk of the absorbent layer is still paper fibers, but in amongst them are tiny crystals made from a material called polyacrylate. Polyacrylate has an extraordinary property. These dry crystals can absorb more than 200 times their own volume of liquid, turning water into a dry gel in seconds. Polyacrylate is made up from long chains of molecules. When they're exposed to water, the chains stretch and swell to form a net that locks up the liquid. The water cannot escape. Unlike a sponge, it won't be released again, even under pressure. It's this property which keeps baby's skin dry, even sitting on a wet nappy. 97% of this slug's body is made up from a natural gel very like wet polyacrylate. Years before polyacrylate was invented, chemists built up their understanding of gels by looking at nature. But slugs did not directly inspire the first superabsorbents. The super dry nappy is just one technology that was not invented.
One lovely example of how an initial invention actually ended up having an entirely different use was the gentleman who invented a gel-like substance for preserving silk underwear. This was just before the Second World War. And of course, by the time the war had finished, he'd lost his market. So he was very persistent and searched high and low for other alternative uses for the product. And I wonder if any garage mechanic realizes that when he or she dips their hand in that gel-like substance at the end of the day to clean their hands, that it in fact was originally invented to preserve ladies' silk underwear.
They wore their itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny floaties ultra baby bikini. That's what they wore to go out and play.
Although the disposable diaper has no clear-cut inventor, it is the product of more than 500 patents.
2, 3, 4.
Basically, a patent is a deal. It's a deal between the inventor and the state. The state says to the inventor, we will grant you a monopoly for a limited period of time, but in exchange for that, you must fully disclose to us what your invention is, and we publish that disclosure. One of the great assets of a patent system is that it provides a huge pool of ideas in every technology you care to think of. And you get this cross-fertilization of ideas which help you to create a better product in your particular field.
There are now more than 32 million patents worldwide. Another million are added each year.
It's an unfortunate fact of life that only a minority of those good ideas actually reach the marketplace, because there are market forces that dictate what is going to be successful and what isn't. And unfortunately, there are some very good ideas which will just not reach the marketplace, for example, because the price at which they can be sold is not a price that the market will bear. From a patent point of view, technological change is almost entirely market-driven. Patents are about money, and therefore what we get are inventions which the market wants.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think that's a great oversimplification. Necessity sometimes, I think, is the mother of invention, but far less often than most people think. And I think what people don't realize about inventors is the extent to which inventors invent markets.
The success of the disposable nappy is dependent on a certain set of social and cultural values. We live in a culture in the West where we try to distance ourselves as much as possible from our natural odors, for example. Then, in the midst of this process of busily scrubbing ourselves and perfuming ourselves and keeping our houses as antiseptically clean and sparkly as possible, then along comes a baby that's not trained in the use of any of these cleanliness technologies. What you're effectively doing with a disposable nappy is placing a bin liner around the baby, which allows for an efficient, neat, and antiseptic disposal of waste.
I know you're antiseptic, your deodorant smells nice. I'd like to get to know you, you're deep frozen like the ice. He's a germ-free Adelaide.
We now value disposable diapers for their convenience. But before they existed, you either washed dirty ones yourself or paid a laundry to do it for you. The vast majority of the world's babies still grow up never wearing disposable nappies. So nappies are not the response to a basic human need.
The market myth is the notion that technology is simply produced in response to general demand for something, that people have some basic human need for a product or service. And the danger with that is it renders the average individual into a passive, impotent role. How can you argue with a group of people that say, you can't argue with market forces? Well, that's the way it is. That's reality.
Human needs are not always universal, and our technologies reflect this. Our culture values parking space. When demand exceeds supply, we say, sell it to someone who'll pay. The parking meter was invented to do just that. A parking meter sells time. It's made up from a coin mechanism plus a timer. At the heart of the timer is this balance wheel. The wheel is the timer's heartbeat. It spins first one way, then the other, taking 1/5 of a second each time. The first mechanical clocks that worked like this used swinging weights instead of a wheel to time the heartbeat. The gears count the beats and so measure time. This is a replica of a clock built around 1330. It rang a bell which called the monks of St. Albans Abbey to prayer. Some of the earliest clocks were sand glasses. The pinch in the middle allows just a few grains of sand to fall at a time. In this glass, each grain takes 1/10 of a second. An hourglass needs 40,000 grains. First the sand glass, next the clock, finally the parking meter. Yet some cultures never invented any of these things. Why?
To ask why Aboriginal people didn't invent the parking meter seems a silly question, but it relates very profoundly to their concepts of time and property. There are essentially two ways of looking at time. One is a circular view that time repeats itself recurrently. The other is a linear view of time that sees us as progressing forward very often. In Aboriginal Australia, living people incarnate the ancestors of the dream time. So when people die, they return to their ancestors. They become part of the landscape. So you can say that rock is my father, because I care for it in the same way that I cared for my father when he was alive. There are strangely shaped rocks, creeks, caves, pools of water, which were made by particular ancestors and are filled with their power. So you have to respect the landscape. The European concept of land ownership is that it's a form of possession which gives you the right to exploit the land for profit. The Aboriginal concept of ownership is that it's a custodianship or guardianship on behalf of a wider community and on behalf of the ancestors. The parking meter isn't needed in Aboriginal culture because it's unnecessary to divide time up into such small segments, and there isn't a concept of one person owning a place where someone else has to pay to leave their property. Because if I park my car in your settlement this week, you will have the reciprocal right to park your car in my settlement next week. Neither of us would demean the other by insisting on exacting a price for it.
The need to sell space with parking meters has grown out of our peculiar way of life. The trouble is that we tend to discount technologies developed inside other cultures.
We evaluate technology, I think, essentially in terms of its complexity, so that we see our own culture as moving along a trajectory towards ever more complex technology. But for a small-scale society like Australian Aboriginal culture, it's essential that you can manufacture and use everything that you need for yourself. The spear thrower it's like the Swiss Army knife of the desert. It's a multi-purpose instrument which is designed to do three things. Firstly, to propel the spear. It's also used as a carrying dish and as an adze, which is used to shape wooden artifacts. The simplicity of Aboriginal technology, coupled with the fact that within living memory they were still using stone tools, makes it very tempting for us to see them as a survival from a primitive period of our own past. We think of difference as being related to progress, such that we are progressed. Anyone who is different from us must be less progressed and placed lower down on the ladder. For Aboriginal people, it looks very different. Aboriginal people see us as obsessed with material wealth, incapable of remembering anything without writing it down or putting it on a tape recorder, unable to find water in the desert. And so their values are concerned more with depending on other people rather than on your own innate resources.
The culture which created the first clocks didn't build them just to tell the time. This machine also symbolizes order, reason, and certainty. These were new values in a turbulent 14th century. The clock reflected a newfound faith that man can shape his destiny if he knows what makes nature tick.
We think we have very clear sort of cause and effect. We're very good at kind of constructing narratives which make us feel in control. And I think that undoubtedly wasn't the case for a lot of the early Middle Ages. I think the early Middle Ages were undoubtedly kind of really very frightening times in which to live. The world interprets everything that happens very much as part of God's language, so that if there's a thunderstorm, it's a sign that God is angry. If there's a comet in the sky, that's a sign that it's going to be a pretty shocking and terrible year. From the 11th to the 14th century, the world is in some ways getting less mysterious. People are beginning to think that they can understand how it works and that it does have its own rules.
The 13th century used technology to explain the universe. Religious artists suggested that angels might use mechanisms to move the stars and heavens. Just 2 centuries earlier, this would have been heresy. The mysteries of the world had been for God's understanding alone. Now, machines might also magnify human power on Earth.
You get the idea that God is himself a clockmaker, that he has created the world like a clock, that he sort of set it going. And therefore, if you yourself are making a clock, that is not something that's kind of wicked or wrong. I mean, you are actually following the pattern that God has set. We assume now that you have to have clocks and that you really need to know what the time is. But there were people who were sort of, if you like, living through this revolution who realised that actually it wasn't all a plus. And there's a really nice poem by a Welsh poet of the 14th century, which goes like this. Woe to the black-faced clock on the ditch side which awoke me, a curse on your head and its tongue, its 2 ropes and its wheel, its weights, heavy balls and its yards and its hammer, uncivil clock, like the foolish tapping of a tipsy cobbler, a blasphemy on its face, a dark mill grinding the night.
But a world driven by clocks was only one change. The next 5 centuries also brought new attitudes to commerce, bringing demand for even more technology. The role of an engineer began to emerge. someone with know-how, who seemed to be able to solve problems.
Know-how itself is an interesting concept. It probably originates in the 19th century in America. The idea of the American inventor on the frontier of civilization, using his own know-how, good old Yankee know-how, to develop indigenous technological solutions to the various problems which he faced. And that's been a very strong current in American ideology in the 19th century, but also into the 20th century too.
Wayne, New Jersey. This house is a shrine dedicated by its owner to one of America's heroes. He wasn't a politician or a general. He was an inventor. The word inventor wasn't common until the 18th century. But in the next 100 years, inventors seemed blessed with a divine gift to create technology. They appeared to hold the keys to progress. Thomas A. Edison is the most revered of them all. The man who lives here has made his home a monument to Edison and the technology which is his legacy. Edison's track record is impressive by anyone's standards. 1,093 patents in a working life that spanned almost 70 years. His most famous inventions were the phonograph and the incandescent lamp. He was more than an archetypal inventor. He seemed to personify some of the spirit of the new America.
He was kind of a folk hero in America, and people looked up to Thomas Edison. With his name on any product, it would bring quality and everlasting, and people would buy a product because it had Thomas Edison's name on it. So he was quite a man.
Charlie Hummel has been collecting Edison memorabilia for the last 25 years. He now has over 200 phonographs, hundreds of Edison's papers, light bulbs, even the great man's fishing license.
I think the personal things to me mean a lot more than the artifacts. Edison physically had this fishing license in his pocket. Occupation, inventor, age 74, height 5'8", weight 170, color of eyes gray and color of hair white, complexion fair. Signed, Thomas A. Edison.
Edison lived in an age dominated by powerful individuals. Large corporations were still unusual. He could keep both a hand in commerce and a finger on the pulse of technology. New discoveries meant the time was ripe for invention.
There are times in history where individuals do undeniably play a bigger role. Often this is in a situation where the technology is in a state of flux, where if individuals can get just a little bit of insight, a little bit of leverage on how to do the technology one bit better, then they will have an advantage for that period of time.
With trunks and toll and telegrams and all exchanges too, just very well, and we will push you through. Ring a corner archway, be safe now, ring anywhere, we're waiting on call.
In the Popular Hall of Fame, Alexander Graham Bell stands with Edison as a truly heroic inventor. The accolade is justified. While it's hard for us to imagine life without the telephone, in the 1870s, Bell's foresight was extraordinary.
It was by no means, it seems to me, obvious at that time that it was really important for two people to be able to speak to one another over wire. I think it's obvious in hindsight. And I'm not saying that without Alexander Graham Bell, there never would have been a device to transmit speech, but it might have happened some years later. It might have taken on a very different character than it does now.
This seems an extraordinary claim, but in the 1870s, the telephone was just one amongst many wonders of the age.
In the early days, America was very wide and very big, so they had lecture halls and they had people traveling around the country demonstrating the latest technology in America. And they pay 25 cents just to come and hear somebody talk. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. It was just magic to hear the human voice come from a piece of steel. People gathered from all over the United States to hear these lectures take place.
To the public, Bell, too, was a technological wizard.
At that time, Bell's telephone did not work very well. One of the tricks that they would use is they would shout familiar quotations from Shakespeare or from a popular song. They'd sing a popular song so that people could fill in the gaps when the transmission wasn't very clear. Bell is a showman in this sense. He can go out on the road with Tom Watson, his redoubtable and very famous assistant, and they can be, let's say, 8 miles apart. And Watson by then has gotten so used to using the telephone that he can shout into it, cup his hands, project his voice, focus it just right so everyone in the lecture hall can hear the human voice coming out of this little tiny device up there on the platform. And Bell can do the same thing, going back and forth. And they have a marvelous effect on people. People are just amazed to hear the human voice coming out of this simple little device.
We were kind of proud, the Americans, that this is going to bring the world together, even the United States together. People in the country can talk to people in the city. This latest technology was just so exciting in the 1850s and 60s and stuff like that, and 80s.
Exciting, but not at first sight essential. The early telephones were not seen as a threat to the existing communication system. The Morse telegraph used a key to send a long or short pulse of electricity down a wire. Different combinations of long and short pulses for different letters of the alphabet. At the receiving station, a sounder clicked away with the message, or it was recorded onto paper tape. By the 1870s, telegraph wires were going up all over America, but the number of messages was growing even faster. What the telegraph industry needed was a technology to send several messages over the same wire. Its inventor would be richly rewarded. Edison and Bell both raced towards that goal. Edison won, but in doing so, he missed out on the invention which would ultimately replace the telegraph altogether. In Washington's Library of Congress, there is a clue to why Bell, not Edison, went on to invent the telephone.
The thing that's unique and different about Alexander Graham Bell, and I think is the main reason why he is the inventor of the telephone, is he had an extensive background in teaching and working with the deaf.
Bell didn't know much about electricity, but he had studied anatomy. He understood how the human ear picks up sound waves from the air. The ear uses a diaphragm to transform the sound waves into vibrations which are carried by tiny bones in the middle ear. But he also had a deeper, personal inspiration.
Bell's wife was one of his students, a deaf student, and he fell very much in love with her and wanted to also make his way in the world and make fame and fortune. He didn't want to just be a teacher of the deaf. He felt that he could invent something unique and wonderful that would set him up and set up his new wife for life. Bell knew what an impoverished world deaf people lived in, and I think that's why he became uniquely obsessed. Bell's obsession was the transmission of speech.
If you're in the telegraph industry and along comes the telephone in 1876, 1877, you're going to look at it and you're going to say there are two things that concern me about this. First is everything has been devoted towards getting 2, 4, or more messages on a single wire. The telephone comes along, and that's only going to be able to allow one person in New York to speak to one person on the same wire in Chicago. And so it's a poor use of resources from a technical or economic standpoint. It's also puzzling because the telegraph, which has 40 years of tradition already set down, is by no means a personal technology. And that means that when you look at the telephone, which real strength is for person-to-person communications, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you want something that is that personal and doesn't really make good use of the existing public wires?
Partly through obsession, and partly through his lack of understanding about electricity, Bell went ahead anyway. His notebook shows one of the very first sketches for a telephone.
What you see in the diagram is, on the left-hand side, you see a kind of a crudely sketched cone and diaphragm into which you would speak. And then you see a little squiggle with the letter A on it. Those are the bones of the middle ear. And then you see an electromagnet. And the idea is you speak in, you set the bones into vibration, and those vibrations are translated into an electric current by the little electromagnet. So He figures if I can do that, then I can follow the analogy of nature, then I can do what the human ear does electronically. It's really that simple.
To men like Edison, who had far more experience with electricity, Bell's design looked unworkable. They thought the sound vibrations would be too weak to make it work. But they were wrong.
His idea is so beautiful and so simple that it never would have occurred to a professional electrician. There's a wonderful quote at the time, I think it's made by somebody named Moses Farmer, who said that if Bell had known more about electricity, he never would have invented the telephone. He would have never gone down this whole route. He would have abandoned it.
Bell's unconventional approach brought success. His story reveals the very human nature of technical creativity.
The amazing thing about human beings is we don't just store information and repeat it back the way a computer does. We transform. And this transformation leads to errors in certain situations, particularly on the kind of task a computer would do well, but is also a source of creativity.
Edison sometimes stumbled on an invention, but as the archetypal heroic inventor, he is remembered more for his sheer persistence.
He had one saying, which I think is one of the best sayings I ever heard. He would say it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And it's kind of true today. You really have to work very hard at what you want to do. Even him, when he worked in his laboratory, he punched the time card to prove that he worked about 114 hours a week. I like Edison as a man himself and what he represents. He was a human being. He went to work like everybody else. He drove a car. He ate apple pie and milk. He's just like you and I.
I think inventors are clearly special people. And the best inventors clearly are very creative. But we think that that creativity can be understood. It needn't simply be waved off as some kind of magic or entirely genetic or something of that sort. We don't have to simply regard them as mysterious or freaks or something like that.
Yet that's exactly how inventors, scientists and engineers are portrayed, as freaks.
There is a popular notion that invention and creativity comes about because people are in some ways socially marginal. We argue if the person is really, really peculiar, then it's possible that they're going to do really kind of off-the-wall, eccentric, creative things. Now, this myth, it just pervades again and again and again.
There's a whole set of things that we normally associate with the person who produces a scientific or technological invention. And these are characteristics that we can trace very far back in time because they're the same characteristics that we find that people gave to the medieval sorcerer, or even in many cases to the shaman, the witch doctor. In fact, in some cases, and this is an image that you can trace back to proto-science fiction fantasy stories, there's often an underground laboratory. It sort of gestates in the womb of the earth, somehow out of sight, hidden, and then before it comes forth into the world.
We're going over 3 miles a minute.
Even today, you find that if you interview people who live near nuclear power centers or laboratories, they'll often talk about underground rooms or underground laboratories. And of course, all of these myths that we have are constantly being reinforced. Nuclear weapons are buried underground. There are secret things that somehow go down into the earth. Another characteristic that this man has is a sort of tremendous inner coiled strength, a power which can be dangerous to us or to himself. He's likely to crack, he's likely to go mad. His madness comes from this tremendous inner force where the spring gets screwed up too tight, so to speak, and breaks.
I have lifted the veil. I have created life. Wrested the features of life from life. Now do you understand? For the lives of those who have gone before, I have created life.
It's curious that this image we have of the heroic individual inventor, or the dangerous individual inventor, whichever it is, became particularly strong around the time of Edison, which was just the time when research was becoming collectivized. And Edison was one of the people who invented the Industrial Research Laboratory, the factory for invention.
In the early 20th century, growing corporations found they could no longer depend on eccentric inventors for new technology. They needed a steady stream of new products to sustain profits and expansion. Electricity and mass production brought labor-saving machines to homes and factories. It seemed the future would be a brighter, better place, all thanks to a stream of technological invention. Slowly, a different myth replaced the heroic inventor, the idea that if it could be done, it would be done, by an anonymous corporation.
There's a very different approach to technology. We no longer feel that technology is something that we understand, or at least that somebody in the family understands, or at least that the guy down the block understands. It's something that's understood by people off in some remote place, and typically people who work for a corporation. It's the XYZ corporation that understands this technology and therefore that controls it. And this is naturally bound to make us anxious.
What is this place? In fact, this anonymous chemical plant makes the superabsorbent granules used in those disposable diapers. Most of us can't possibly know how all technology works, but it's comforting to know that even quite new ideas have the same annoying habit of not doing the job they were designed for.
Since the Second World War, the image of the heroic inventor has tended to dwindle. And if you point at any of our more recent inventions, you're much less likely to have the public say, oh yes, the laser, that was invented by A.
The first laser was built at the height of the Cold War and immediately classified. The basic design is still the same today. Lasers exploit the property of some materials to produce an extremely pure form of light. The heart of the first laser was a single crystal of pure ruby. At either end, a mirror ground almost to perfection. Hit with intense light from a powerful flash lamp, the ruby is pumped up with energy. Deep inside, one atom releases its energy as a pulse of very pure light. That triggers others to do the same. So the pulse gets stronger and stronger as it bounces between the mirrors. One mirror is made deliberately imperfect, so part of the pulse leaks out each time until the energy in the rod is drained. Today, not all lasers use a solid ruby crystal. Gases and liquids will also work. This supermarket scanner uses a laser. Like the disposable diaper, it's a typical modern technology in having no one inventor. It's a combination of many technologies. Each product in the supermarket is given a unique number. The number is represented as a barcode, a series of thick and thin printed bars. Inside the scanner, a laser shines a beam of light into a system of mirrors. One of the mirrors spins round on a motor, so the laser beam comes out, sweeping along a pattern of lines. There is only one beam, but it sweeps so fast that our eyes see the complete pattern. If the beam crosses a barcode, it's reflected back where the pattern is light and absorbed where the pattern is dark, so the reflected beam flashes on and off, like Morse code. The long and short flashes are picked up by a light sensor and decoded by electronics to give the product number. In turn, that lets a computer in the till identify the product and charge for it. Compact discs or CDs work in a very similar way. A CD is mostly plastic. The plastic protects a thin aluminium disc, which is covered in a pattern very like a barcode, except the bars are just 1/100 of a millimeter wide. The CD player uses a laser to read the tiny pattern on the disc. Its beam is infrared, so it's not visible to our eyes. Like the bars on a barcode, the pits on a CD represent numbers. The numbers stand for the vibrations of a sound wave, not groceries. But the laser technology is almost the same.
If you had set out in the late 1950s to invent a better way of storing music, or to move people through supermarket checkouts faster, I don't believe for a minute you would have invented the laser. Once you've got a laser, what happens with it depends very much on the environment. And when the laser was invented, what drove the applications at first was the perception of military use, the death ray, the James Bond image, which nearly everybody is familiar with.
There's a very old image of the ray. There's this magical ray. We see it in old paintings and drawings and so forth, whether it's radiating out as a halo or the evil eye. And this has carried forward right into modern times. There were dozens and dozens of films featuring magical rays and death rays.
Gunfire! Save yourself, Flash! You'll be burned to a cinder! I'm setting you free first! He has chosen his own death!
They're often called death rays, but they also can do all sorts of wonderful transformations. We find them altering living creatures, making them larger, making them smaller. We find them healing. They're healing rays and these things, but most commonly they're the death ray, which is used to destroy cities or wipe things out and so forth. All of these things get mixed together until it becomes very hard to disentangle and say, wait a minute, somewhere in here there's a little laser that's used for communication or something and not used to irradiate females or to blow up cities or transform living flesh into monsters and so on.
Powerful military laser systems do exist. Yet the destructive power of a laser has never yet been used directly in a real war.
There were a number of practical problems that really meant that this sort of death ray concept has not come to any reality. But what does work is using it as a way to mark targets. You shine a relatively low-powered laser from one aircraft onto the target, you illuminate the target with the laser, and the smart bombs, which we all saw used in the Gulf very effectively, have a sensor in the nose of the bomb which picks up that illuminating spot and flies the bomb deliberately to the marked target. So instead of being the means of producing the destruction directly, the laser guides the destruction to the target, not the idea that was originally envisaged.
There's a famous film, not famous at the time, but since became famous because the star was Ronald Reagan, in which death ray is used to shoot down airplanes, which bomber airplanes were the great fear of the 1930s, and justly so. And so a ray would be a good ray if it could destroy attacking bomber airplanes.
50 years later, Reagan was playing a new role, a president promoting the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Enormous quantities, billions and billions of dollars have been spent by the military on secret programs trying to use the laser as a death ray, trying to use them to burn up tanks and so forth. Unfortunately, it's just been money right down a rat hole.
So even the apparently straightforward laser, like most technologies, proved to be very unpredictable. Today, it's no longer seen as a highly specialized death ray. Instead, a laser is just another tiny electronic component available off the shelf. Lasers are built from parts exploiting many other inventions, and a laser needs many more inventions around it to be useful. Marking surfaces is one of the most common laser applications in industry. The world market for laser products is now worth over $100 billion a year. Many laser systems do use the focused power of laser light to cut, burn and weld. But the overwhelming majority are found in applications that have very little to do with death rays. Perhaps it's because the laser still seems new that an aura of mystique persists around laser technology. In many ways, the laser is the archetypal technology, a power which can be used for good or for evil. Our culture is still coming to terms with technology. We do not charge the earth with mystical power. Instead, we have built new myths around technology and where it comes from.
The question is, how do you come out of this? You don't come out of this with a nice, simple 2-cent answer you can give to the person on the street. But clearly, if you're talking about how does something like the telephone get invented, there's certainly going to be market forces, there's certainly going to be social forces, there's certainly going to be brilliant and almost heroic individuals involved. No one of these myths stands alone, but each contains a partial truth. And taken singly, any one of them as a total explanation doesn't work.
Somehow we imagine these two separate spheres, nature and technology, and yet really they are not so different as they seem, because technology is absolutely a human activity. It's as natural for human beings to have technology as it is for birds to make nests or for fish to swim. Before we were human, we had technology, and we became human through technology.
If we understand a process, and we can begin to monitor it, reflect on it, and change it. If we don't understand the process of technological change, in a sense, we're always going to be victims of something we're doing ourselves. That's the interesting paradox. We're doing it at the same time we're victims of it.
It seems like it's inherent in technology that once you reach a certain point, once you start communicating and putting things together, technology is going to take off like this. It's somehow in the nature of knowledge that when it reaches a certain point, it will begin to feed on itself and take off. And that's where we are now.